So I'm going to pick up where we left off in part one of React Basics. And basically in this video, we're going to add in properties or props and states for the different components. Now, very similar to like a center HTML tag, you can define an attribute for any one of these components, right? So I can just go ahead and add in name equals game1 to this attribute and to this component, and obviously it won't render anything out because in the game component we're not responding to this, but we can. And basically what, instead of doing the hello from game hard-coded, we can say hello from, use our curly brackets, and then use this dot props dot and then the name of the attribute that you use in the actual tag itself. And it seems as if props is going to be a property bag where you can pass in, names and objects and strings and also functions. So we'll take a look at that later in the video. So now if I click save here, come over to the browser, and then here it says hello from game 1. And then obviously I can duplicate this tag and then change these attribute names accordingly. So there should be 2, make this a 3, click save. Let's take a look at it. And then I get different instances of the game board with this name. So that's very similar, very simple actually. And there's actually, I'm not going to get into the details here, but I also seen where, within these props, you can do a property type to define that. When you define the name, you can specify the different type for that property as kind of like a type safeguard when using these. Again, you're not going to get IntelliSense for these though, because when you hit a dot, it's almost like a property bag because these are dynamic. So as you can go in here and define these, you just have to copy and paste or remember the name that you're using in order to make sure that you're not doing something silly like name 1 and then come back to when it tries to render, scratching your head to say, hey, why is this not rendering the name, right? Because there's a mismatch. So that's one of the things that you have to be careful of. I haven't personally tried the prop type or property type notation within these components, so I don't know if that adds in IntelliSense and make them. I know it for a fact it makes it type safe, but that's the benefit of it. But if it adds in IntelliSense, I'm not sure. So that's something we have to take a look at. So either way, so what we want to do now, instead of hard coding the square, right, to do this hard coded text, we want this to read out the value that's passed into the square. So we're just going to do this dot props dot value, and obviously we haven't defined it yet. So what we can do, we can come in here and set each one of these guys to let's just do it to A for now. So this should initialize the board with every square having a value, which is not a standard tic-tac-toe option, right? So that's all set. And that's all hard-coded, right? So what we want to do now, let's kind of make this dynamic. And in order to make this dynamic, let's go to our board component, right? And define, give it a state. Now, and that's the other piece. So the best practice, well, actually, let me just go ahead and build the state. So in order to build the state bag or the state for this component, you have to initialize the constructor, or explicitly display the constructor. And because the constructor is inheriting, because our board component is inheriting from this React component, they have this super constructor syntax to where you have to initialize the base class, in our case, which is the React component. So that's going to be standard. Now, once we have this, and obviously the constructor is going to fire just like standard life cycle for a class. The constructor is going to fire first. Now what we can use the this dot state, and then we can start setting some properties or initial values for here. So what we're going to do, we're going to do this values. We're going to define a values property within the state, and we're just going to initialize that into a 9-element array, right? Now, the model is, and this is the best practice piece here, is that right now we have several components defined, right? So we have the out of the box, or part, I'm gonna call it out of the box. It comes with the project because we named our web part tic-tac-toe v3, right? So this is a component within itself. So really, this is going to be our parent component. It's going to define all of our HTML, so on and so forth. And then we came in here with our game component, and then really just another layer, and then we're making a reference to the board. And then within the board, we're doing the square, and then we have a private member or function that's rendering each row, which is like 3 squares for that row. But our board, in our case, and for this scenario, and you have to define where you want to put this, right? Our board is really going to be our state component that's going to manage the state outside of all the individual squares. Now, from a separation of concerns, this may seem odd, right? It's like, if allow the square, ideally I would say each individual square should be managing its own state. And if the board needs to figure out, okay, who played, or what's your value square, do you have an X, do you have an O, it should ask the square, or the square should respond back and say, hey, here's my current state. I'm at an A value, or I'm at an X value, or I'm at an O value. It probably wouldn't know, as far as like separation concerned, who the player is at the square level. It wouldn't be responsible for that. Maybe that's a board level, a board responsibility, or a game responsibility to know as far as the player. But in my mind, I think definitely the square should know, if it's been played, what is his current value, and all this other good stuff. But in the tutorial, and I'm finding this very interesting, they said that from a performance standpoint, you want to manage the state at the parent component. And I think, as you kind of look at when we start to layer in the Ajax calls and all this other good stuff, I think that's going to be true, right? I think they say this, it's not a good practice to have the square, for an example, making an Ajax call. You want to centralize all those Ajax call into a particular component, and then use the props to communicate that data down to your child components. So I think that's what that the pattern is what they're trying to enlist here. So with all that said, what we're going to do is that we're going to manage the values for each one of these squares in the board itself. And we're going to do that using this 9-element array. And we're going to store that into the state. Obviously, we can make this a variable, but I think because of the way React works, it makes sense to store this in a state property bag. Okay, that may be clear, that may not be clear, but part of this, I'm just kind of following along, and I'm trusting that folks who have years and years under React development know what they're talking about as far as like the performance value. So I'm gonna just blindly follow that pattern and concept. Okay, so so what we have here, we have this array, and basically what we want to do, we want to initialize the value of the array. So we're going to make some things up. So let's do this initial vals, and we're going to set this array to, and this is going to represent our board, right? I'm sorry, our plain board. So we're going to say something like, let's make the first element blank, the second element X, third element blank, and then let's copy this. Actually, this should be blank without a space. And I'm going to just do a new line only so we can easily see if there is an issue, because we can easily follow along based on the positioning. Okay, so that's that. All right, so let's put an O here. Let's do a cap O. And then a cap O here. All right. And let's kind of tighten this up a little bit. All right, so that's going to be our initial value. And basically what we're going to do, instead of setting this up to an empty array, let's do initial values as our initial values here. And basically what we need to do is to somehow get the array values into these squares. But when we do that, we need to maintain the index, right? So obviously we can do something like this. I'm gonna do this manually just so that we can see the concept, and then we'll start adding in loops and all this other good stuff to make it more dynamic. So I'm gonna just purposely do like a 0 here. Let's copy this all. Right, so I'm gonna do, let's just make that 0, and this 1, and this 2. Now, because I'm doing this in the render row, I'm only going to be playing around with these first 3 elements. It's just going to repeat that, right? So let's save this all. And then let's just make sure we didn't screw anything up. Right, and I think this represents our initial value. So we're only playing around with this row, and we're just repeating it 3 times. Right, so it's blank X and O. Just to make sure there's no shenanigans, add X here in the first element, save it off. All right, so now we got XXO, and it's just being repeated, right? So now we need to bring in this guy here and this guy here. Now, in order to do that, we need to beef up our render row. So let's do something like a start index. Define that as a number parameter. And then let's do a column count. And basically what we want to do, we're going to have this guy. Oh, okay. So this is crying. We'll fix that later. So what we want to do, let's loop through. Let's create a for loop. Var I, initialize it to 0. And what this for loop is going to do is going to spit out the number of columns we need for this particular row when we call render row. So let's just make sure that I is less than the column count requested by the caller, and then we want to increment this so we can spit out all the columns, right? So let's initialize var column empty array, and then basically we're just going to push in these elements. So we're going to do a push, and then really we're just going to do a square component, right? And this is going to push in, if they pass in 3, which is going to be our case, this is going to push in 3 squares into this array, and now we want to render that array. And we can do that very simply by doing curly brackets column, still within the div container. So let me format that, and that so far is looking right. We're not using the start index initially. We just want to make sure that this for loop, and as far as pushing in squares and displaying the array of squares per row, all that's working accordingly before we go gun-ho. So now I have 2 parameters I'm looking for. So starting index, let's just say 0, the number of columns 3, and I'm going to just make this the same for all 3 of these, and then we'll fix it later. All right, so now save this all. Now we should get a blank board, right? Because we're not setting any values. Okay, so we're good with that. So we got, we still got our 3 squares per row. So this for loop is working as expected. So now what we want to do, let's set the value for each one of these guys. And our value is going to come from our property or property bag within the state, which is just values. And then here, that start index, I want to take advantage of that now by selecting and say, okay, for this array with these initial values, come on, keep me all squared up, please. All right, so for this array with these initial values, we want to start dynamically dropping in the index. Now, I'm calling this guy 3 times, so I need to control where it needs to pick up in that 9-element array. So for column 1, I'm sorry, for row 1, it's going to be 0, 1, 2. So the next one should pick up at 3, and then the last one should be 6, right? So every 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right, 0 base index. That's how. So that's right. That's right. So now the start index, that's going to pass in and say start at 0, but we need to increment the starting index, right? Or else we're going to stay at 0. They're all going to be 0. So let's just do start index plus plus, and then that should solve it. So let's take a look and see how far we get. All right, so if I'm looking at the board and comparing this to our array, XXO, OX blank, blank X blank. All right, so now we have all 3 rows represented and all 9 elements represented on our board with our initial value. So all of this looks great. And if I come up here and add in like an A, for example, save that off, only the second row, third column should get the A. Second row, third column should get, and that's for every instance, right? So this is our initial value. All right, so this is good. So this is good. So now we have all of our values here. We're managing all that through our state array in our parent component, and we're just pushing down the values to these squares. Now, what we should do is allow these squares to respond to a click event, right? So that's how it's played. So users who come in here, click on the square, they're either going to be an X or an O, and it should update the value for the square that was clicked. Now, actually in React, that's actually pretty simple, surprisingly. So all we have to do is that on our square component, we're going to do an on-click event, right? And then we can pass in, let's do that. We can pass in a function. So there's a couple things we have to do. So let's define a function, and we're going to define this at the board level. And we're going to say handle square click. This is our function that gets called every time a click is passed, right? And then console, let's just log out every time this guy gets clicked to make sure that's responding. Hey, you clicked me. All right. And you is not yet defined, so we'll define that. So handle square click. So on our square, now here's the cool thing about it. In the sample, and I hate this, right? I hate when they name everything the same, even though it represents 2 different things. And so I say that to mean that they did an on click here, right, in the example, and then they just call the handle. Let's do the this got to be in brackets, right? It's JavaScript. So this dot handle square click, right? So this is what they do in the tutorial, but realistically, this on click, and it made me think initially when I saw this, was like, oh, so they're just representing this on click here, but actually no, they're separate. This on click here is based on this div tag, that's standard JavaScript, that anytime something element is clicked, it's going to call that click event there. But in our case here, we can name this whatever we want because this is again, this is just a property on our square component. So what I want to do is I'm going to name it on square click, right? And tell it to call the handle square click method on my board. And in order to wire this up here, I got to do a this dot props dot on square click, right, with parenthesis. Now, I know I made a mistake in doing this because this is a click event. There's special way that you need to bind. So basically, we're trying to create a delegate that says when this event is clicked, call this function. So in order to do that, we have to use the arrow notation within, I believe this is ES6, within ES6. And once you do that, and basically it creates that internal function call in the delegate notation, and it's calling the on square click for our props. And the same needs to be done here. So anytime there's an event, you have to use this type of notation to handle that. All right. So let's save this off and see if this thing is actually going to work. Now we're right into the console app, so we're going to have to bring up the console window just to make sure that this thing is working as expected. And let me clear. Okay, so there's a warning. I know how to address that. Let's just make sure that we got click. Yep. So every time something clicks, it doesn't duplicate. I think this is a Chrome thing. It doesn't duplicate the message. It's just going to do a count that says, yep, you are clicking that, and it's repeating. So our click event is responding, which is pretty cool, right? I mean, now we have a child event that's bubbling up to the parent, and we can do any business logic or handle that at the parent level, even though we have multiple instances of the child and we're doing that dynamically. So this is actually pretty cool. Now we want to take this a step further. So right now our message is generic. We don't know which square clicked it, right? So so we need to identify that. So let's just do a ID, right? And we just call this a number. And then our ID is just going to be a representation on the square within the index. So let's just do a start index here. Right, so we're going to pass that in here. Now we don't have to do anything on the square, right? Because this is still, and it's odd to me. Actually, let me push these out to another line so we can see everything. Let me just drop this click event to another line, so it's easy to identify it within the div tag. Now this wasn't 100% clear to me that the function that we're calling, okay, so this is the on square click. We're passing this function in through the property bag for the component, right? That's what we're doing here. This is the on square. Let me just drop these to new lines so they're easier to read. So this on square click, but so this is going to call this function here, and we're passing this function as a property to the square component. But this function handle requires a parameter, right? But the function itself does not require a parameter, and this is why this guy is still empty. So if if that handle click needed 3 or 4 different parameters, this guy, as of right now, is not going to be responsible for that. It's going to say, hey, I'm gonna just call, this property function, and it is just expecting that this guy here to pass in all the needed parameters that's required by this function, and everything seems to be working as expected. All right, so now what I want to do is just to make sure that each one of these clicks are representing for the square that's being clicked, and not just generalizing it. I want to read out the ID of the square that fired the event. So I'm going to say, hey, ID equals ID plus space, you clicked me. So let's save this off and eyeball our console to see exactly how this is working. All right, so this is saved off. So now I click. It says hi ID 3. You clicked me, and that's not right, right? So the first row, everything on the first row is 3. Everything on the second row is 6. Everything on the third row is 9. Now I ran into this, and I know why this is happening. Um, and this is where the reference and value of a variable becomes into play. Now, what's happening is that we're passing in this index, and it's looping through the index, and it's setting the value of this index on as this parameter here. Now, what's happening is that this guy, for whatever reason, when you do a plus plus, this is doing a reference of whatever value is stored in this index variable versus a copy. So the last one on this row, as it iterated through on the first row, was 3, right? It started at 0, went through, then 1, and then 2, and then so actually, yeah, that should be 2. No, it was 3, right? Because it increments after it sets it. So it's a 2, then it comes down increments into 3. Well, because this is a reference, all those guys got 3, right? It's almost like whatever, the last value in that memory location, whatever, for that variable is there. So in order to force these guys to get a new value every time we set it on the handle click event, we need to add another variable, and how you define this variable is important too. And I think this is so what I'm gonna do a let, and I'm gonna just call this ID. I just want to be careful that I'm not reusing a variable. So let ID, or index, let's just call it index, equal start index, right? So now I'm defining the new memory space every time, and now I can add this guy. Oops, what happened? Copy, add this guy here. So this is going to get incremented. It's going to have a new value. It's going to set it to index, and index is going to say, hey, here's your new value, and it's going to maintain that. It's not going to do a reference. And that should be true for this guy here. And then also, the warning that we get here when we first load the page, let me just refresh this again, is that every child element in the array should have a unique key. And this is just from a React standpoint that, hey, what it's saying is that you're loading all these squares into this array. I need a unique key so that when there is an event, or if there's something that needs to change on this square component, I can easily and more efficiently identify it. I guess through an instance of a maybe an index or something like that. So what we want to do now is also add the index here to represent the key, right? And that's just going to make that that issue go away. I think this is right. So let's save it. Let's go back, hit a refresh. All right, so now this is, let me clear the console so we can get a fresh look. And now if I click, so ID 0, you clicked me, 1. Okay, so now we're good. If everything's got a unique value, of course you can repeat. Each one of these guys are represented. You stick on one. All right, this is working as expected. All right, so now we're confident that the square that's being clicked is accurately being represented. We can now go in and update the array every time the square is clicked for that particular position. And we're going to do all that in the handles click event. So again, with the references and immutable concept within React, and because of the shallow DOM and all this other good stuff, there's a few things that do not seem obvious that we have to consider and we have to take into account. So basically, all we want to do is say, okay, for this state, values, right? And this is going to be values for all squares on the board. What we want to do, we want to dump a copy of those values into a local array. We just call them vals, right? And we have to do a slice here. So I'm not 100% on what the slice exactly do, but to my understanding, it's taking a copy of those values or the copy of that array and dumping into this local variable and not doing a reference to that. So the same issue that we just saw with the for each loop, we want to get a copy of these values. So once we get a copy, um, so now we have a copy of the array of values, and it's a copy, it's not a reference. Now what we can do values for the ID of the square that, which is the index position within the element. We want to set that right now. We're just going to set that to A, hard code this. And now, so that's going to get an update to A. And now we want to reset our state or update our state with the new array. And we do that through this dot set state. Right, and this is almost like an object with the property bag. So values, set it equal to the new vals array. And this line right here is ultra important because the set state, what it's doing is that it's triggering to React that says, hey, the state of this component has changed. You need to reevaluate everything for this component and then update or re-render this component because something in this state has changed. So now if we do this, we should get A's only for those squares that have been clicked that's responding to or notifying the click event. So let's see what happens here. Okay, so I already have an A here. All right, so this is working, right? I can't change that one. I can't know it's changing, but I can't tell it it's changing because it's already an A. And the cool thing about it is because of the state of the component, even though I have multiple instances of that component, each component instance is maintaining its own state, which is exactly what we expect it to do, right? And we're kind of used to that with web parts. You know, as you're defining a web part, that web part is managing its own state. You know, you're not going to get duplicate values across different instances of the web part unless they're obviously leveraging the same data source. Okay. All right. So this is working as expected. So the click event is setting the A. We update the state. So and when we do the update to the state, the React component re-rendered, so everything looks good. So now we don't need this. So now that we have a click event that's set in the A's, we don't need this initial value. That was only just for testing purposes. So we can comment this guy out. And basically what we want to do now is just initialize a 9-element array using this notation here. Oops, not semicolon. All right, so now we come back here. Hopefully, if this works, everything should be blank. And now when we do a click event, now we can start adding A's for the square that was initially clicked. And this is working out. So this is tic-tac-toe, right? So we're not playing with A's, we're playing with X's and O's, and we need to alternate. So in order to do that, what we need to do is let's build up our state property bag and put in a player 1, right? And that's just going to be an object. Player 2. And this is going to be an object. And then next player. And this is just going to alternate between the two. Right? And this is going to be an object. So basically, there's a couple ways that you can do this, obviously. To me, it makes sense to have, you know, a player that's an object that has two properties. One, the name, and then the value, meaning that the value is either going to be an X or the player is going to be an O. The next player is just going to be a toggle that says, okay, player 1 played, now it's player 2's turn, so on and so forth, right? Just a core concept of the game. Now, in order to do this, what we have to do is initialize these players with initial variables. Now, the reason why I'm doing this, and I went through the trial and error and figured this out. obviously we can just do initial values here, right? We can do you say the value now, this guy is going to be X. X is always first. My brother never liked that, but X is always first. So then it was player 2, then value, and then O's. Okay. Now, the problem that we ran into, obviously, if I wanted player 1 to be first, I can copy this out. But when you do the initial, and I'm sure there's other ways around this, but for me, when you do the initial logic that says, the next player and asks if next player equal to player 1, that will return a false, right? Even though the values were the exact same, it didn't look at these two as being the same object. So in order to get around that, in my, limited thinking on how to resolve these issues and still try to remain elegant, um, I'm defining these initial values in these local variables here. Could be overkill, right? So player 2, and then now what this is allows me to do is that for player 1, I can just do P1. For next player, I can just do P1. And then for player 2, I can just do P2, right? Cool. All right, so to make sure that this is working as expected, I can now go down to my board render method and say hello from board, and then H3. It is this dot state dot next player dot name turn, right? And this should flip flop if we have this. If so initially, so it's going to be player 1, but after the click event, we want this to flip flop. So actually, let me just save this. Let's take a look and make sure everything is working as expected before we layer in the next piece. So it's player 1's turn, and right now it's not flip-flopping because we don't have that logic in yet, but at least it's reading from the state, and the state read seems to be correct. Okay. All right, so let's add to the click event just to change the state. So there's a couple things we can do here now. Instead of doing the arbitrary A, we can do this dot state next player. This actually should be called current player. I mean, just to really add to the logic, right? It shouldn't be next player, it should be current player. So whatever the current player is. So current player, all right? So current player, when we look at the handle, the current player dot value, this is going to say if they're X or O's, and it's going to register their value, right? It's going to update the all of the states. But now we need to do the if logic to flip flop them, to toggle. So if this dot state dot current player, so this is where you can get into a lot of trouble without IntelliSense, equals this dot state dot player 1, then just toggle this dot set state, right? Current player equal to this dot state player 2. All right, and then for the else, we can set that to player 1 because that means that player 2 just played. player 1. All right. So in this change here, we updated the click event that says, okay, instead of doing the A, right? Let's say whoever the current player is, mark their move, update the states, and then flip flop the player, so the current player becomes the next person, right? So now if we save this, and hopefully this works as expected, there's a couple of things we can look at to ensure that this is working as expected. Now we expect the player 1 to change. Uh-oh, something broke. Ugh. All right, what happened? So this state slice current player dot value. Did I not current player? Did I not spell current player right? This dot state dot current player dot value. Okay. You see what's wrong? What's wrong? Oh, this is all syntax wrong. I'm not even sure how that. No, no, no. This dot state. That's right, right? You need a semicolon. You need a semicolon here. From a syntax standpoint, it didn't blow up. Let's see. No click event. What's in the console? Let's see. Is there a console error? Cannot read property value of undefined. Okay, I see it. So this is this should be player 1, not prayer. I need a prayer. I do need a prayer, but it's player 1. It was prayer 1. So basically, I was referencing the state property that did not exist, and that was the error, which is a runtime error. All right, so now if I try it, all right, so now we're working. We're flip-flopping between X's and O's. Oh, we can even change them, which is cool. The new way of tic-tac-toe. But I think in the end, right, this is pretty cool. All right, so I think that's it for this video. I mean, obviously, you can add to this and, start talking about, determine the winners, put in a check to where you can't change them because, usually with tic-tac-toe, once you made your mark, there's no erasing and flip-flopping. So, we can add in those different conditions and things like that. But I think for what we wanted to cover in this video, as far as handling click events for child components, managing state at the parent component, and then passing those down. Um, as far as like manipulating the state, the set state, and forcing re-renders and things along those lines, understanding how we get a lot of this stuff for free just because we're dealing with the React framework, it becomes very, very simplistic and interesting once you understand how to play in the React world, which is something that I'm still learning. But I think we covered a lot. So the next piece that I want to look into, and I haven't honestly, I haven't gotten to it yet, and it probably take me a couple of days to get with it, because usually before I film these videos, I practice. I go through a lot of this over and over and over just to kind of get used to the syntax, the nuances, with some of the formatting, some of the type of calls and stuff like that. Like, with these uh, click events, using the I heard this is called the fat arrow, right? I don't know, but the fat arrow notation to bind these pass. When you pass this function as a property, how this need to look at the at the child component. Now, another thing that I did not look into, but I saw that because this is a state-free or a stateless component, there is another way that you should write this component if you do not require um, the management of the state of that component. And to my understanding, that optimizes um, React or the component significantly, because it relaxes additional checks and monitoring, like digest and stuff like that, and watches, right, that React needs to do for that component if it knows that it's not going to ever use a state. But in order to define this as a stateless component, there's a different syntax on doing that. And from a best practice standpoint, I've read that you should try to have as many stateless components as possible, and to use components that require state as sparingly as as much as possible, because it really has a significant impact on performance. But right now we kind of define everything as a component with the potential of having a state, even though we're not using the state within that component. So there's some optimization that I would have to do to make this a stateless component. I just don't know those right off, but that's just one of those things to be aware of. Okay, so that's it for this video. Hopefully in the next video we get into some Ajax calls and really start to leverage these components, as well as the Office UI components, to actually display and handle SharePoint data. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.